Any more questions at this point? Great. So let's, moving forward to panel 2. The report on supplemental report on costs related to cigarette and tobacco products. This was an issue that started out last year in Subcommittee 4 because we heard concerns about whether the administrative and collection fees on the program were appropriate or not. And we know that the county commissions have a cap on the administrative fees, but there are no such caps at the BO, Board of Equalization. So we wanted to get an opportunity to hear from you.
Seth Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I'll be providing you with a brief overview of BOE's cigarette and tobacco programs. I'll be talking about 2 distinct programs that BOE has, a tax program and a licensing program. My comments will run roughly parallel to the handout we've distributed, which is also available on our website. I'll start with the tax program. The centerpiece of that program is the excise tax on cigarettes, which is 87 cents a pack. The state also imposes a tax on other tobacco products with a rate that BOE adjusts every year, currently about 29% of the wholesale price. BOE collects both of those taxes from distributors, so they've already been paid by the time those products reach retailers. In the 2013-14 fiscal year, the cigarette tax raised about $750 million, and the tax on other tobacco products raised about $90 million. As you can see in the graph on page 2 of our handout, most of the money raised by these taxes goes to 2 special funds created by ballot measures. Prop 10, which funds early childhood programs, and Proposition 99, which funds health-related programs. A small portion goes to the General Fund and to the Breast Cancer Fund. The administration's proposed 2015-16 spending on the cigarette and tobacco tax program is $25 million total from all funds. We have a graph on page 5 of the handout that shows the breakdown of proposed spending from each fund. Now I'll turn from the tax program and tell you a little bit about the licensing program. Since 2004, state law has required all retailers, wholesalers, and distributors of cigarettes and tobacco to be licensed by the state. To get a license, you have to pay a fee, meet some record-keeping requirements, and consent to occasional inspections conducted by BOE. Turning to page 7 of the handout, we have a graph showing the difference between the administrative costs of the licensing program and the total amount of the licensing fees. At the very beginning of the program, the licensing fees, plus the various fines and penalties assessed for violations, were the only source of program funding. That changed in 2006 when the governor's budget proposed funding the program not only from the licensing fees, but also from the cigarette and tobacco tax revenue that goes to the 4 funds I was mentioning earlier. At that time, the legislature approved that change on a temporary basis, and later on, the 2009-10 budget approved it on an ongoing basis. In the coming year, the administration proposes spending $10 million on the licensing program and allocating the costs according to this recent practice. Last year, some representatives from Proposition 10 programs expressed concerns about the administrative costs of BOE's cigarette and tobacco programs, as well as the allocation of those costs. The legislature responded to those concerns by approving supplemental reporting language that set 3 requirements for BOE. The first requirement was to submit a report describing BOE's expenditures on these programs and explaining how the costs are allocated across funds. The second requirement was to convene a stakeholder meeting to discuss funding options for the licensing program, which was the main concern raised last year. The third and final requirement was to submit a report describing at least 3 options for funding the licensing program, including at least one that would increase the share of costs covered by licensing fees and another that would increase the share covered by the general fund. That concludes my presentation, and at this time I'd be happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you. I think we have some questions. Mr. Tang?
Well, my only question was, usually the LAO has recommendations. Does LAO not have any recommendations?
Not at this time. I think in our understanding was that our role in the hearing would be primarily of a descriptive nature.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I want to jump in here just so I don't miss my opportunity to give voice to some concerns raised to me by our local First Five Commission in San Mateo County. You've talked about this issue, rising administrative costs at a time when there's a declining source of revenue. Locally, there are some program costs that were unanticipated when the initial funding measure was passed. Can you just talk a little bit about, I appreciate the reporting here, but sort of what the roadmap is going forward in terms of funding streams? Is there a way to fund this licensing program without draining money that trickles down to the counties? There's a basic fiscal concern here, and can you speak to where we go in the future here?
Well, the supplemental reporting language set us on a path to consider, set the legislature on a path, I should say, to consider a variety of funding options for the program going forward. So that process started with the initial report, which gave us from BOE, which gave us a sense of sort of what the costs are, sort of a little bit of more detail on that. The stakeholder meeting where stakeholders presented ideas for how to fund the program going forward. And then just yesterday, we received the final component of the supplemental report from BOE, which lays out, I believe it was 11 options going forward for funding the program. And sort of each of those were distinct ideas submitted by stakeholders, and certainly those are options the legislature can look at going forward.
Do you have any suggestions for us? I mean, we'll certainly read through the report, but I have you sitting here today. Can you just provide a little color to your testimony? What are some of the ideas that might gain some traction, which are fiscally feasible? Can you just give us a little bit of additional insight?
Well, we haven't assessed the fiscal feasibility of any of the ideas, but I can just give you a sense of sort of what's in there. So there are 11 total. I'll just give you a couple examples. The first one that was mentioned was to make so currently the fees that are assessed on retailers are on a one-time basis. So you register, you pay your retailer, you pay $100, and then as long as your license doesn't lapse, you can renew without paying a fee from then on. If you have any issues and then you have to re-register, then you might have to pay the $100 again. So one idea that was put forth was to have the fee paid every year, possibly of a different amount than is charged currently. So that's one option that stakeholders submitted. There was a mix of ideas, some of which involved additional revenues, some of which involved continuing the current practice, others of which involved trying to find cost savings. So those are all. I mean, we have not, just since we received it yesterday, we haven't conducted a thorough analysis of any of the options. Okay,
just wanted to, Mr. Chair, if I could allow Mr. Parrott the opportunity, if you had any additional thoughts at the outset here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Richard Parrott. I'm the acting chief of the Special Taxes Policy and Compliance Division at the Board of Equalization. Mr. Kirstein did touch on the stakeholders meeting. I was here today to report to you on that. If I could just give you some brief highlights. With regard to the supplemental reporting language, the BOE did conduct the stakeholders meeting on November 13th, 2014. In anticipation of the meeting, we reached out to about 39,000 stakeholders, including licensees, fund recipients, and other industries within the programs. Our meeting was attended by 53 people, and we received verbal proposals at the meeting and also written proposals subsequent to the meeting. 11 proposals were written in the final report that was transmitted to the legislature yesterday. Mr. Kirsten did touch on a couple of the highlights of some of those suggestions. One was to increase the tax on cigarettes and tobacco products was another alternative that was in the report. Another one was to begin taxing products such as electronic cigarettes, dissolvables, and other types of products. I'm happy to answer any other questions with regard to the report. I know it was sent over yesterday, and we did get it out to the stakeholders this morning after it was posted to the BOE website.
Before getting to you, Mr. Cooper, I just have a quick question to follow up on Mr. Mullen's question. Excuse me. The suggestion you had about continuing every year collecting a certain amount on the license, the one-time paid license fee, how much do you expect future years would, in perpetuity, would generate, given at what recommended price of a license? And I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to pencil that out, but if you have some thoughts on it, or Mr. Parrott, if you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. There were two proposals regarding recurring license fees that were specific amounts proposed from the stakeholders. One was for a $750 annual retailer license fee, and another one was for an annual retailer license fee of about $248. Those were the amounts that were proposed. We've had an ongoing licensee population at the retailer level of 37,000 licensees. That's been fairly static for about the last 6 or 7 years. So we're seeing we issue about 6,000 new licenses every year. Those are typically turnovers of an existing business. So in our in our fiscal analysis in this report, we did project what those license fees would produce based on keeping a 37,000 retailer licensee population.
Now, obviously, you don't expect there to be a drop in the number of retailers given this nominal increase, nominal for businesses that are transacting volumes.
You know, we didn't project on that in here. If after these proposals there ends up, being a proposal that the legislature decides to kind of take and look at, and if we had bill language with specific language, we would be able to do a full analysis and projection and maybe look at what that might do with the recurring license fee to a retailer population. I know there would have to be some sort of assumptions made on that of if that licensee number would drop at this, at all.
And I'm going to ask Mr. Cooper to hold on to your question one more second. I apologize, but just want to know, why was it even set up this way? If you can indulge me in just a background education, just a 101 on it. Why would there be a one-time fee when we can reissue the license and create an opportunity for maybe not issuing it again to a retailer if we choose not to?
Just the background that I have in the history of the program, because I was with BOE at the time the AB 71 was passed and worked on the implementation team. I believe that the California Retailers Association had a strong voice at the hearings for that bill, and it was passed with that one-time $100 fee, and from what I understand, it wouldn't have gone through if there was an annual retailer fee. That's just the history that I have in the program. Okay.
Mr. Cooper, thanks for your patience.
Just following up on the chair's comment, a lot of licenses at the local level are reissued every year. And Mr. Parrott, I know that either CVS or Rite Aid is going to stop selling tobacco products,
right,
and Target too, so the market is going to go down. So I'm going back for the last 7 years or 8 years. It's $7 million annually. That's, obviously we're running a deficit. So how come we haven't figured out something before to address this issue? For so many years, we're running a deficit. Obviously, we're paying for it somewhere.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
For the past 7 or 8 years, you've run a deficit of $7 million per year.
Right.
So, being new to the legislature, I'm just trying to figure out, wrap my arms around it. Why are we still running a deficit? How come this hasn't been addressed before?
I think because as Mr. Kirstein talked about, as far as the history, there was that adjustment to the budget that was temporary and then made permanent as far as the shortage in the funding for that licensing program was covered by the funds from the benefiting funds from the cigarette licensing program. That was the basically the way of resolving that issue.
So with some of the retail establishments not selling tobacco products anymore, it's obvious that deficit is going to continue.
As far as the deficit in licensees?
Licensee, yeah.
With seeing CVS close out in Bel Air, it hasn't impacted it greatly. and you're right. We will have to see if there's a trend of that. But that licensee population still remained at about 37,000 every year, even with those other businesses closing out. Other ones are opening up because there's still a demand for cigarettes. We have talked about this before. With businesses like CVS closing out, people will still go buy their cigarettes. They'll just look for another location and would afford an opportunity for another business to crop up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Bro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, I'd like to echo, excuse me, my colleague, Mr. Mullen. Similarly, in Orange County, they've come to me and said, with declining revenues, they're hit with about $1 million a year for collection fees. My question is, with the declining revenue pool, your costs remain the same. Why wouldn't you aggregately go down in your expenses when there's less to collect?
Well, the licensing program, we are enforcing the cigarette and tobacco products tax laws throughout California, and we still have a population of 37,000 licensees. The BOE does 10,000 retail inspections a year. Those inspections are for the BOE to be out there present in the field and to make the retail community aware that BOE is enforcing the licensing laws, and it is to protect that revenue. Without the enforcement out there, that's jeopardizing those revenues to be able to go down if BOE doesn't have a presence. So, even though the revenues have gone down, our taxpayer base has remained static and the same, and we're enforcing the laws, and the costs are driven by our taxpayers, not by the revenues.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the legal cigarettes that are on the market and how we need to be enforcing, whether they're legal or illegal being sold in our retail establishments. Yeah,
we also have, we have the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement at the federal level that California needs to exercise due diligence in enforcing all of its tax laws, the cigarette and tobacco products tax laws. And inspectors are out there making sure that cigarettes that are legal for sale in California, based on, the Attorney General publishes a tobacco directory of what's legal for sale in California based on the Master Settlement Agreement. They're making sure that everyone's complying with those laws, and if there's contraband cigarettes for sale in California, those cigarettes are seized, and retailers are seeing that's not acceptable. Those aren't legal for sale in California.
And just to follow up, how much revenue do you estimate is the fraudulent cigarette sales that you could be collecting with legitimate sales?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. We do have an evasion estimate that's on the BOE website that was published in 2014, and I could get those numbers for you.
Okay,
it's
great.
an extensive report. Okay.
Mr. Chair, just a follow-up on both those issues in regards to the First Five. I know I've met with First Five, both statewide, Orange County, and a couple of other areas. And I think the challenge we have is that you have declining revenue, but yet you have just as many inspections, all those other issues that have got to keep going. And so it does put the squeeze on that issue. We've looked within, and one of the issues I've offered up, and that is if there's a concern about our efficiency, because I certainly am concerned about making sure that we are not using money that should be going out to First Five. I've been very open. I think the board would be very open to having state auditor come and help us. If there's some efficiencies there that somehow we're missing, then we should be open to those. So I think that we've just got that challenge that we have there, and in that declining revenue, but yet our responsibilities still stay about the same.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm also concerned about First Five revenues as well, and so my office has been doing an extensive study on e-cigarettes and these vapors that are out there to try to figure out what the market looks like and how much potential revenue we could be generating, because they are not currently taxed the same way that other tobacco products are at this moment. So more than happy to share the report with you if anyone is interested in tackling this issue as well, to see if we can generate additional revenues.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Ms. Marion O'Malley, who stood up a few minutes ago when Mr. Mullen asked the question, to come up to be able to potentially offer a response as well. But I want to go to Mr. Cooper for another question before that.
Yeah, regarding these 10,000 inspections you do annually, what do they consist of?
It is BOE staff inspecting a retail location. The BOE staff goes in there. They're checking the retailer's cigarette tax stamps to make sure that they are valid California tax stamps.
And that's the inventory they have.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the retail inventory. BOE inspectors. California's tax stamp is an encrypted digital tax stamp. They scan that stamp to make sure it's valid. With tobacco products, the tax is paid through invoices. That's our proof of tax. So inspectors are making sure that they're in possession of invoices showing tax-paid inventory. They're making sure that those cigarettes are on the tobacco directory in California, legal for sale in California. And they're also doing a cursory glance to make sure that they're compliant with the Stake Act laws for that their signage is up for not selling to minors.
And most of these folks are folks that have signed up, so it stands to reason pretty much they're going to be on the up and up and not sell the bootleg products, so to speak. In some instances, I'm saying other markets, people sell, I'll call it bootleg tobacco, but most of these establishments are registered through BOE, so for the most part, not everybody, they're going to be on the up and up, though, in most instances.
Correct. They are licensed with BOE. There's a very small segment that wouldn't be licensed. What they typically find are retailers in possession of untaxed tobacco products.
But the inspections are primarily at registered places, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
But they do also go, I believe, I'm not with the inspections division, go into geographical areas and we'll also look at all of the retailers within that area, also making sure they have licenses too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Gibson?
Thank you very much. My question was answered, but for Mrs. Moth, you would also provide me a copy of that around e-cigarettes. I'll be interested to see that report. Thank you.
By the way, I'd be happy if once you distribute the copy, I'd be happy to get it to all the committee members. Thank you.
Marianne O'Malley from the Legislative Analyst Office. I don't have much to add beyond the comments of my colleague Seth Kirstein, but in general I can just put them into some categories. Essentially, your options are three, and they're not really very good options. Option one is to increase the fees paid by the distributor. And that was an issue that was discussed when this bill was first created, the licensing law, and it was rejected at that time. But you can reconsider that and increase the fees, increase the revenues coming into this program, and that would pay some of the administrative costs. That's option one. Option two is decrease the cost of the program, decrease the amount of regulations, decrease the amount of staff that there are involved working in this program area. May not be desirable, but that is an option for you that could reduce the program's cost. And the third option, again, which is not a great option, is to shift more of the costs to the general fund and away from the first five funds. And that, of course, would place greater pressures on the state's general fund and is also not a great option as well. So essentially what you're dealing with is a trade-off between three different types of choices. And they're very difficult to get your hands on. We do have the proposal by the Board of Equalization, the report that was released yesterday, and we'll be happy to review it and add any other additional thoughts that we have. But essentially, your choices are one of those three.
So I'll jump in if there's no other questions just yet. Option number two, what threshold do you put at maximizing dollars coming into the program, yet doing it with a sufficient enough of a staffing level that will not absorb further costs and take away money from the program? What are some of the thresholds that you've been able to come up with?
In terms of reducing cost to the program, you're correct in terms of if you reduce the amount of inspection, you may reduce the amount of compliance. It may not be a desirable outcome. It may not be a desirable choice. Perhaps the Board of Equalization has done some analysis of this in terms of it when they've examined their staffing patterns and might be able to give you some more information in terms of the cost-benefit ratio of the number of staff, the number of inspections, and the yield that they get associated with that.
So you're saying that no matter what, and these are questions. I'm not trying to get to a certain point because education is such a key component, and at most times education seems to be the cheapest alternative instead of capital investment or enforcement. So I'm a firm believer of that. But in order to move forward, let's say at some point there's going to be $0 coming in, let's say to the point where the cigarette sales are extremely minimal. at that point, are we still going to be expending, and is this program going to be completely reliant on general funds in order to continue the educational educational factor or enforcement, making sure that we still get everyone to license, or what it is that we're trying to accomplish with all the educational and enforcement? The question got a little muffled as I was trying to conclude it, but you get what I'm saying.
I think managing this program's costs, given that so much of the revenues are one-time in nature, is going to be extremely difficult. I have not looked at this program in any depth, and perhaps Board of Equalization can give you a more extensive response on that.
Any questions? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I had one more thing if I could add.
Please.
I think it was Mr. Bro had a question about the evasion, the estimate of the evasion. I did get that number. It's $214 million annually for cigarettes and other tobacco products is the estimated a tax amount that's being evaded. That's on our that is on our website, and I'll still send that to you as well.
How much?
$214 million.